I really appreciate all you guys do for sure. So yeah, I have a special guest, Michael Johns, who is a National Tea Party coordinator, actually founder, excuse me. Let me get my notes up here so I can speak to what I'm talking about. National Tea Party movement co-founder, leader, White House speechwriter for George H.W. Bush, and heritage policy analyst. Michael Johns is in the house. God bless you, sir. Thank you for joining us here today.
Hey, it's a pleasure. How are you?
I'm really looking forward to a discussion, man. I know, a lot of us, our age time frame, have been in this kind of fight against, socialism and/or the subversion of American Constitution for a long time. Some of us have been forgotten. I think, in some ways, maybe you have been, my friend. Can you tell us a little bit about your history in D.C. and kind of what got you involved in politics in D.C. in general?
Well, tonight, this is an ongoing struggle in my view, so it's not, it's kind of like what we're doing today, what we're doing tomorrow is what matters most. But, in my case, my political and public policy interests go all the way back to my late teens as a college student at University of Miami, where I was president of College Republicans, did a couple internships in Washington, D.C. with a great place I always like to plug, one of which was the National Journalism Center, now affiliated with Young America's Foundation, a great program for emerging student journalists of non-liberal persuasion. I went on and worked at the Heritage Foundation for 5 years after getting my economics degree from the University of Miami, and worked as an editor of Policy Review. That was their flagship publication at the time, was subsequently acquired by the Hoover Institution, and then was promoted to foreign policy analyst. I did a lot of work on the Reagan Doctrine, which is now, I guess, history, but an important part of history. It was the policy under which Reagan and conservatives supported sending military and non-lethal aid to resistance movements fighting communist dictatorships around the world, backed by the Soviet Union. It essentially sent the whole message to Moscow at that time that their expansionism was not going to be met unmatched, and was, in my judgment and the judgment of a lot of historians, a centerpiece in the peaceful end of the Cold War. And as part of that, I visited with the Nicaraguan Contras in Nicaragua as one of the first Americans to actually get out to their base camps. I visited with Jonas Savimbi's UNITA forces in Angola, which were engaged in fighting the Cubans and Soviets and communist regime in Angola. Got out with the Cambodian resistance movement, Sihanouk forces in Cambodia fighting the communist regime there that was supported by the Soviets, and wrote and spoke pretty persuasively on this, and did a lot of other, that's a Cliff Notes version.
That's interesting. I spent
some time component of my work.
I spent some time in Peru while I was in the Marine Corps. So I got the special briefing about what was happening in South America in 1994, 95 timeframe, or actually 97, 96, 97 timeframe. So aware of what was happening down there as well.
Yeah, well, it's an important part of history, and unfortunately and sadly, the case of Nicaragua, they continue to fight basically the same regime that they were engaged in supporting then, run by literally the same man, Daniel Ortega, who was running it then. And, while so much disproportionate attention is placed on Venezuela, appropriately on Venezuela and on Cuba, the two sort of known socialist/communist regimes on our hemisphere, there is a third one in Nicaragua. It's equally repressive. It's and it's also, confronting the realities of a population that does not want to be subjugated to socialism and totalitarian governance, and one also that the United States policy, in my judgment, needs to pay more attention to and have a policy developed to. So then, just to kind of speed through this, the Cold War comes to an end, and I decided to broaden out. I had a broad range of public policy interests. Many of them went beyond foreign policy. And I went to work with Governor Thomas Kean in New Jersey, and helped him in a broad range of outreach in education and in HUD work that he was doing. He was on Jack Kemp's Low-Income Housing Commission, chaired it, in fact. Was doing some innovative work with charter schools and education choice. and was on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, which was sort of his first foreign policy engagement, which I kind of helped facilitate. He, in a way, you can't underestimate the importance of that affiliation, because he ultimately went on to run, as you know, the 9/11 Commission after 9/11, in part based on that experience and his the credible reputation that he had at the time. After actually Kissinger had been the first selection and he recused himself. After that, I wrote a pretty widely cited New York Times column for him on why I thought George H.W. Bush was preferable to Bill Clinton, who was then the sort of not just the Democratic nominee, but the presumptuous leader in the 1992 presidential race. Got a whole boatload of attention, including being brought up in White House press conferences and attention in the West Wing. And that opened, really one of the great opportunities of my lifetime, which was to serve as a White House speechwriter to President George H.W. Bush, and to be part of that pretty remarkable team of talent that existed then. Worked after that administration with the International Republican Institute, part of this National Endowment for Democracy a family of organizations loosely affiliated with the Republican Party. And then in the U.S. Senate as a senior aide. And I, kind of in the 90s, the Cold War had ended. Some of these issues seemed to be kind of resolving in conservatives' favor. And I didn't want to be one of these DC hangers-on who sort of spent their whole life in Washington, D.C., floating from political appointment to political appointment. And I wanted to utilize my academic background in business and my and my general skill sets in it. And I sort of entered the healthcare profession in the mid 1990s. I started with Eli Lilly in the pharmaceutical area, and went on then with a series of co-managed healthcare consulting practice out of Philadelphia. Was part of the executive management team of a company called Gentiva Health Services, largest home health and specialty pharma company in the country, and then ran a division of a large medical device company in South Jersey, where I had some good success growing it from about 3.8 to 30 million in revenue over 3 years. And then, of course, as you refer to the Tea Party movement, I had been engaged a lot in investor relations and gotten into the practice of watching CNBC in the morning for some insight on the day and on the markets. And I was one of a handful of conservatives that morning who caught the Rick Santelli rant. A loose network of conservatives that I'd been a part of came together with a conference call within 24 hours of that, and we brainstormed about kind of a reaction to it. And the original plan that we put together, which I fully supported, was to put together a series of national rallies on April 15th, 2009, across the country to express support for three policies, basically: adherence to the Constitution, limited government, and lower taxes. Three very simple policies that we felt the vast majority of the country supported. And also that we felt were easily understood, and were core to the foundation of the founding of the country, and thus build the bridge between, kind of Tea Party reference that Santelli made, what we planned to do, and the policies that we thought needed to be adhered to at that point. And, really the importance of that call, which, I don't think any of us recognized, in fairness, at the time. I mean, a lot of people, who say, oh, well, no, we realized we're founding this movement. It was going to prove iconic. It was going to change the whole direction of the country. Probably overstated. I don't think any of us really envisioned that it would take the role of a movement. The idea was just to kind of have this one day and sort of see if we could rattle the country a little bit and awaken some involvement. It was not, as you probably well know, a lot of opportunity for political involvement by the vast majority of Americans. And sadly, I don't think the Republican Party was offering that opportunity for people. And
yeah, my political involvement during this time was screaming at my TV, yelling at Facebook, and throwing bricks at my Twitter account.
You weren't alone. I think you were joined by tens of millions of Americans. You were doing the same thing. And That if you look around, I mean, I can't think of any moment politically in this now 30 years of engagement of involvement that I've had when things look so bleak. You had Obama, who had just been elected, not overwhelmingly, but he was perceived to have a national mandate. He had the media glamorizing, as you'll recall. He had the House in control of Nancy Pelosi, the Senate in control of Harry Reid. So complete legislative green light for anything he wanted to do. Academia in the hands of the left, the courts largely in the hands of the left. There really was almost no institution in the country that was not at that moment, politically or otherwise, being run by individuals who embrace this ideology that itself is, controversial. And I believe it's a very minority viewpoint of the American people. I mean, the American people, I think in my judgment, are centrist, maybe center right in their perspective. And they weren't being represented and they were frustrated. And just like you, I think they were looking for an opportunity to do something more than just complain about it. And one of the great opportunities that emerged from the Tea Party movement was a classic supply and demand phenomenon where we offered an opportunity for individuals to be constructively involved in doing real tangible things to alter the political and policy outcome. And we had tens of millions of Americans who were looking to do exactly that. And by, most math, there were roughly about 40 million Americans who ultimately got involved in the Tea Party movement in some capacity. They either signed up on an mailing list, or they attended an event, or they contributed financially, or were involved in some way, and continued to be involved. I think this movement transformed American politics. Even if I had not been sort of at the centerpiece of it, I think I'm being intellectually honest in telling you that it's the singular most important political development of the American people, of grassroots political activism in our history. I don't want to diminish the civil rights movement or the anti-Vietnam War movement, because they were large, and in some respects, in fairness to them, we benefited from the internet and the opportunity that presented to bring people together more quickly and more easily. But by all math, it's a vastly larger movement than even
that movement. If you would have told me from 2007, 2008, when I was literally screaming at my TV every time I saw someone hop on TV, to 2010. Now let's fast forward a little bit when we actually started getting some traction in Congress. Can you talk about kind of that transitional period between 2008, 2010, when we started to make some waves in DC for real?
Well, pretty quickly, this movement, given the size, so on April 15, 2009, I'm like, I could have gone anywhere in the country probably. I decided to go to Boston because of the symbolic importance of that event there. Fortunately, that was an event we had during the daytime. And then we had a really large event in New York City that night that I spoke at. So I spoke in Boston, went to New York City later that night. In New York, we had 13,500 people at City Hall, with Newt Gingrich also speaking. I always try to give him a plug because he was one of the few established conservatives who, from the very beginning, I think I was in this boat too, saw the promise of this whole thing. And
yep, indeed.
At some point, I got to get around to personally thanking him for that.
Yeah, thank him for all of us, because I completely agree. First of all, his time as speaker was one of the most underrated times in American history, when he was able to get the spotlight on issues that mattered to fiscal conservatives, real true conservatives. And then again, ever since he left, the House and became an influential speaker, he's continued to lift the voices of people like yourself and myself in very many ways.
He has. I think he's a phenomenal political leader. I have had the good fortune of knowing him all the way back to my days at the Heritage Foundation. I think my first introduction to him was a handwritten letter that he had sent me in response to an opinion article that I had written. And he was just a simple member of Congress then. But he has a great intellectual fascination with a broad range of issues. He has an enormous, as a historian and a professor, a great degree of academic background that's pretty rare within Washington, D.C., and certainly within Congress.
Indeed.
Where it's almost completely lacking.
Yeah.
And he was a bold, he brought bold leadership. I mean, he was maybe the Trump of that moment, meaning that he wasn't particularly deterred or concerned about the fact that the established media was going to turn against him, that he was going to they were going to try to make him look stupid, foolish, whatever. They scrutinized every one of his moves. I think he might have even been censored over some book purchase, as I recall. And, I mean, he really put up with a lot, and he's contributed an extraordinary amount as a leader, and has to be, in my judgment, looked upon as one of the pioneers in modern conservatism, and maybe one of the most important elected officials outside of Reagan and Trump.
That is not an understatement. I completely agree with you. Once we got some traction in the House, and I want to say, less than 50 maybe representatives, something like that, in the House in 2010. People like me, you, all kinds of loud voices who were speaking up against the unconstitutional and big government policies of Barack Obama's administration, went through a period of IRS targeting and infiltration into the Tea Party movement, and not just the Tea Party movement, but FreedomWorks, every level of teaparty.org and other parts of the Tea Party movement. Anyone who spoke up against Barack Obama, I often wondered what it was like to live in the early days of Hitler's regime, and now I think we've learned it. Can you give me some inside insight of that time of targeting and attempted subversion?
Well, I think Obama, because he had on the left similar experience as a so-called community organizer. I would never use that phrase to describe me or anyone else in this movement, but in essence, yeah, we organize people politically. He organized people politically. He saw the Tea Party movement immediately as a big threat. He wasn't concerned about conservative political action committees. He wasn't concerned about DC-based conservative think tanks. He never viewed those as a threat to his actual governance or to his political success or his reelection. He immediately saw the Tea Party movement as a vast threat. And, so for a long time, well, I don't know, a long time, but certainly months, when it was, we're in the media every day, and he was kind of pretending he didn't know what it was all about. I think one time he even flew an Air Force One over one of the larger DC-based rallies we had and said he was unaware of it. Then, of course, that became indefensible, and he started denouncing us by name repeatedly on the road. And people, it kind of became, I don't want to say personal, but it became an issue of what was he saying? What were people like me saying? And people like me, I looked at it and I said, look, I'll just be straight up about it, because why not be straight up about it, right? I mean, my policy is to talk about what was really happened. I thought to myself, there's no way that we're going to rally a country against this array of left of center controlled institutions and of Obama and a Democrat controlled Congress without really bold promises to the American people. So when asked at that time, including that very day on April 15th, like, what is the goal of this whole thing? I didn't say, hey, look, we're going to organize some rallies, or we're going to bring some people together. We're going to build some email lists. We're going to, offer an alternative vision. I said we were going to take our government back. Okay. And that was universally greeted by a great response of applause. But let me tell you, I was always nervous saying it, because I hate to overstate things, and I try to be a person of my word. So, and then quickly I was joined by a lot of other people, because I think they saw, like, look, yeah, what are we doing? If we're not doing that, what are we doing, really? And there's too much of this activity for activity's sake, particularly in Washington, D.C., with Washington, D.C.-based conservatives. My view is this is what it was all about. This is what the people wanted to do. This is why they came together on April 15, 2009. So that resonated, and I'll tell you something. I think as soon as that word got out that that's what we were about, that's when this movement that already had attracted the attention of about 1 million people, I think, at least on that day alone, between what were probably about 1,000 plus rallies all over the country. I mean, we by the way, we never envisioned that many. I thought we'd be lucky we get like 50 of them, and most major metropolitan areas ended up being about 1,000. I hear from people who've had rallies that day in small towns I'd never even heard of before.
Yeah, it was all over the place. Just a group of people came together to be there in spirit, and it's, that silent majority has proven to be formidable, to say the least.
But that lesson, I think, is one, and I'm not trying to be braggadocious about it, because it came pretty spontaneously to me. It wasn't really one that I had strategically thought out as much, but one of the lessons, and Trump has said the same thing. If you're going to think big, don't think small. It takes just as much effort to think big as it does to think small. Once we, as I think a leadership group, and as the founders of this event, which turned into a movement, spoke in bold terms, that million people began growing in quantum leaps. People said, you're going to take the country back? That's what we want to do. And they ended up forming local organizations and networking with other organizations and holding more and more rallies, and starting ultimately to oppose predominantly Obamacare, and then the famous town hall confrontations with Democrats over all of the unstated realities of what Obamacare was going to do and ultimately did do to our healthcare system. Followed, of course, to answer your original question, by 2014, where we came back and said, so 2010 we win the House. I think you mentioned about the 10 or so Tea Party. We ultimately had 60 plus Tea Party affiliated Republicans who ran. We started the Tea Party caucus under Michelle Bachmann, as you'll recall, from Minnesota, in the House of Representatives. The Tea Party caucus served as a basis for the development and support of the Tea Party agenda within the House. And we very quickly blocked Obama's legislative plans for the country. So he did have, a brief period of time there from January 2009 until January 11, when the new Congress came in, kind of like Trump did. But he, just like Trump, faced in 2011 a Tea Party House that not only didn't support his agenda, but had a completely different proactive vision for the direction the country should be going. You cannot underestimate, in retrospect, the magnitude of political importance that had, because had Obama continued to control the House and controlled the budget and controlled basically the legislative agenda of Washington, he would have, this promise he made of fundamentally transforming the country would have become a reality. As it became just more bluster from him. He did not
completely agreed. The Republicans in the House, led by the now called Freedom Caucus, Tea Party Caucus, that Michelle Bachmann was targeted and removed for, by the way, led by them, put up a blockade against big government policies and was very effective at doing it. Completely agree. Fast forward up to 2016 and President Trump.
14, of course, is important too, because then we said, well, what's the next logical step? We don't have a presidential cycle in here. In 2012, sadly, a lot of us, so I voted for McCain in 2008. I voted for Romney in 2014. I've always voted for Republicans. I think the only non-Republican I ever endorsed was Doug Hoffman in that New York 13 race that you may recall, when the established Republican there was indistinguishable from the Democrat. But I don't believe in third-party runs. That was a question that came up throughout the Tea Party movement. I said, no, we're part of transforming the Republican Party, saving the Republican Party, making it relevant again, of helping Republicans win elections, and not just win elections for the sake of winning elections, but for advancing this, free market, patriotic, pro-defense, pro-constitution movement that we represent. And so 2014, we had the good fortune of a bunch of candidates emerging, in Ted Cruz in Texas, in Rand Paul in Kentucky, Marco Rubio in Florida, Mike Lee in Utah. And I can't say enough about those guys. They're all, like Gingrich, not just politically successful Tea Party elected officials, but they're serious people who really have spent a good deal of time studying and understanding these issues and keeping their word about those principles. And
they also get the point of the Tea Party, and it's bringing back representation of their constituents. I'm not a constituent of any of them, but there are times when people, not necessarily me, but like me, have reached out to them and have been effective at getting policies changed. That is effective when you hear the groundswell of solutions-based legislation and or policies, and they actually listen and promote them. That's a very effective way of doing it.
Yeah, I have some issues with kind of like what Mike Lee's lately done in some of the opposition to Trump's agenda. That's left a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth. But
Yeah.
but looking historically, when I look at these four figures, kind of like Gingrich, I mean, to me, they're the part of the proudest moments of this whole movement was getting those four guys in there, because it did two things. One is we took back, we said we fired Nancy Pelosi in 2010. We came back and said, we're going to fire Harry Reid in Nevada. And we did that. And we also brought in, like we did, the 60 Tea Party Republicans in the House, many of whom are still there, some of whom are in this administration, like Pompeo. I mean, the list goes on and on of people who are in influential positions in this administration, and said simultaneously that, you know, these four guys in the Senate were going to be thought leaders and represent our agenda. And they've done a really, you know, in my view, a pretty exceptional job with that. So that brings you up to your question, 2016, you know, and not widely known, but something that I've, especially like in the last 6 months or so, brought up repeatedly as people have inquired, like, what is the relationship between the Tea Party movement and this administration? My view is it's a very positive and constructive one. And it's always been a positive and constructive one. I supported Donald Trump day one of his candidacy, June 16th, 2015. I was, I think, one of only a handful, 2 or 3 founders of the Tea Party movement who did. Most supported Ted Cruz, you know, because kind of we get to know these guys, so it became tempting when you know somebody on a first name basis not to support them. And so I respect and I appreciate that they did that. I don't want to diminish any of them for the decision they made. I think they had a lot of questions that Trump would not keep his word, his commitment to conservatives. I took the position that I'd followed this guy really pretty closely throughout much of his career, and he was exactly the sort of leader that we needed. And, you know, the good fortune is I don't think anyone would dismiss that. I mean, we've had a lot of these people have come around and said, you know, you're right. He had to kept his word.
As we talked, you know, myself included, there's probably a good couple million of people like me who believed in the narrative creation of Trump, that believed that his Democrat bases of policies would just further on big government and protection of the Wall Street agenda, that have now seen what he has attempted to do through all of the blockades that have been put in front of him, and still been able to accomplish a lot of very good things that are the foundation of the Tea Party movement of small government conservatism, that now are going to vocally, as I do, support him. That is going to be a shock to the system, I think, to many in the media and many Democrats of never Trump, or quote unquote never Trumpers, who are now strongly on the side of President Trump.
Yeah, there aren't too many never Trumpers left, and the ones that are left are an immense disappointment to me. And some of these are guys that I've worked with over, you know, the early parts of my career, and I used to think were walked on water, and apparently not. But
yeah, I'm with you there.
To answer your question about 16 in more detail, Donald Trump, this can't be stated important enough, and it's on YouTube. You can go research it if you want. It spoke at an event in Tea Party organized rally in 2011. So this is 4 years before his candidacy. He had some general political interest and had flirted with running for president before. But this is really one of the first like major speeches he gave a rousing speech at this event. I think it was in Boca Raton, and spoke a lot of his messaging was completely consistent with the messaging of his 2016 campaign of America not winning anymore, of America being beaten down and ripped off in these trade agreements, of America laying down before China, of NATO. He brought the issue of NATO and of other military financial cost sharing issues up, which of course has been a centerpiece of. He brought a lot of these policies were not, like, to his great credit, like I can't speak highly enough of this. He didn't go down there and say, okay, this is what these guys want to hear. He went down there and said, this is what they need to hear. This is the direction of the party. And this, to my judgment, is what makes Trump such a phenomenal political leader, is that he has saved the Republican Party by making it relevant again. I think in 08 and in 12, definitely, those two candidates who, like I said, I voted for, who would have represented better options than what we ended up with, we're not speaking to, the guy, your local non-political person. They weren't speaking to the stay-at-home mom. They weren't speaking to the guy at the bar talking to his friends, the blue-collar worker. They did not resonate with any of those guys because they weren't talking about the issues that those individuals wanted to hear about. They knew we were being ripped off in these trade agreements. They knew NAFTA was not working as it promised. They knew China was an immense threat, Japan to some extent, a problem. And they knew we were becoming the world's policeman and didn't particularly like it, knew that we needed to defend our interests, but these should be shared burdens, not ones that the United States is obligated to send its own kids to die for and pay for in all cases. And then, additionally, that the border issues and that the immigration issues were not well serving middle-class America. And I'm not just talking about illegal immigration, but the H-1B visa program and legal immigration, which have been used systematically and are continuing to be used to displace American workers who are forced into signing these non-disclosure agreements, training these guys to take their jobs from foreign countries, and then being replaced for someone who has no special expertise, which is what the H-1B visa program was supposed to be, but are simply attractive to employers because they're going to work at a fraction of the price that an American would work.
Yep.
That struck me as something that's unacceptable. And these are not issues that, for the most part, conservatives in DC seem to understand. For instance, when I came out in support of Trump's position on China and implementing tariffs against China, and I'm a free trade advocate. I want free trade. I don't want tariffs. It just seemed like logic broke down. Like this whole idea, and I compared to the national security debate, is like where we talked about the fact that during the Reagan years, we deployed missiles to Europe, and the left would respond and say, that's provocative, you're going to start a war. And we said, no, this is a peace move. This is designed to make it clear to the Soviet Union that we're serious about defending ourselves. And ultimately that proved to be the case, that our military preparedness and strength, that particularly advocated by Reagan, is what ended the Cold War. The same true in these trade wars. We were not putting up any resistance. We weren't making countries, we didn't give them any incentive not to put in tariffs against our exports, or to rip off our intellectual property, or to force us into these shared technology agreements or shared ownership plans, all of which have been completely destructive to American productivity, commerce, industry, and American jobs. So I love Trump from the very beginning, and I'm coming to this final point.
Well, before you get off that, to your point, I hate tariffs too. I can't stand tariffs either. But how do you create leverage? Is what President Trump has done with this. He's created leverage with them.
Like these Cato Institute guys will say that we hate tariffs, and I'm like, do you hate them on China's side, or you just hate them on our side? Do you hate them when China is putting them in place that preclude our exports and kill off American jobs? Because I didn't hear much from them about that. In fact, because when I brought it up, they said, I can remember this particular line, and for a while I intellectually sort of thought maybe there was some credibility to this, but they would say, if China wants to subsidize our production, that's great. That was a really compelling line to me, and that made a lot of sense until I realized millions upon millions of American workers were losing their job, and whole industries were being taken by foreign countries from America. So it was a nice rhetorical line, like many rhetorical lines out of Washington, but it had no bearing in reality. Just like the other issue on China had no bearing on reality, the issue that the development of China's wealth would ultimately contribute to democratization. I can remember very clearly in the early 90s, we were told repeatedly, don't worry too much about those human rights violations over there, because if they get richer and sort of join the first world, the people will have more leverage, and human rights conditions in China have never been worse, and the country's never been richer.
Well, the thing that China has done effectively is, especially with think tanks like Cato, is become foreign lobbyists to them to further China's policies. The thing that I want to move on to, because we only have about 25 minutes left, and I really want to get to an important discussion of economics and the foundation of conservatism and fiscal conservative, the argument between socialism and free market capitalism. I just have a couple of quick notes here that I wanted to lay the foundation of this so we can get to this discussion of that. There are two extremely influential economists in human history that influence the way colleges teach macroeconomics and the thought process behind economics. John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics, whose policies are basically came out of the Great Depression and were a answer to the Great Depression, where he influenced demand through intrusive government policies, where the demand side theory that focuses on the short term and doesn't really picture long-term solutions, where
in the long term we're all dead. Remember,
indeed, where the primary form of macroeconomics that's taught in college these days, and it makes you wonder why there are so many economists and people in Wall Street who don't understand true macroeconomic theory that is created and backed by historical precedent of Friedrich Hayek, who was born in Austria in 1899. Served in World War I, won a Nobel Prize in 1974 for his economic science theory. He has his defense of classical liberalism and the free market capitalism as ideas of how to have an economy that is counter to socialist consensus, is what they called it in historical documents. The socialist consensus. Hayek was one of the greatest thinkers that I have ever studied in economy, and best laid out the differences between big government intervention into markets versus free market capitalism and how the markets manage themselves. The question I have for you is, how can we better define free market capitalism, fiscal conservative, to the younger people that are out there these days that are basically indoctrinated into Keynesian economics?
Well, I think you're right that those are the two most influential economists, one from the left, one from the right. Both have made, we'll be fair about it and not terribly ideological, both have made immense contributions to the understanding of economics. Not everything Keynes has said was wrong. Some of it was right. And yet, it also had the birth of Austrian economics, really, all of which has been the foundation of free market conservatism under Hayek and others. So, which is now prominent in the U.S. and I don't even call it Austria. Doesn't have much to do with Austria anymore. It has to do with what is the free market alternative. So those two are icons. The issue is, to your question of how do we explain this to a younger generation that might be looking at the promises of a Bernie Sanders and saying, "Gee, that all sounds pretty good," and maybe the realities that they're up against today, and say we can do better. Is the first obvious historical fact is that socialism has over 100 years, well, 75 years at least, 100 years of very serious experimentation all over the world. There's no shortage of cases. You can go look at them. And they are not the Nordic countries that the left likes to cite, which are still predominantly today largely free market economies. They have large state spending programs and welfare programs, but they are by no means socialist. So when you sort of say, where is this socialist paradise that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are offering? There is no historical example, just the opposite. Socialism, which is the economic form essentially of communism, which is inevitably the use of military and state force to bring this into practice. Because ultimately, how do you enforce socialism if not by force? has been the sole source of human misery, of the biggest source of human misery, not the sole source, biggest source of human misery over the last century. It's been responsible for the death of 100 million people around the world. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, some of the worst tyrants in the history of the last century have embraced this ideology. And almost nowhere, not almost, I think literally nowhere, can you look at an example and say, hey, look, it's working here. I mean, in our hemisphere, 3 examples: Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, all completely failing, people on the streets opposing those governments. You know, and you know, its experimentation in Africa was a universal failure. You know, its experimentation, obviously in the old Cold War era, Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union, was a colossal failure. Basically, it has succeeded in making poor people poorer, of ultimately creating a culture of political oppression, of feeling an obligation to suffocate alternative views, because as soon as they start failing and people start uprising or being concerned about it, they're very prone toward you know, suffocating and closing down opposition, unlike free market and free societies that allow this kind of vibrant discussion and debate, including a presidential candidate who represents those ideas in Bernie Sanders and in Elizabeth Warren. So it's an issue of, and then on the other side, the fact that the biggest success stories of our lifetimes, certainly led by the United States, which is not perfect. You know, I mean, we're kidding ourselves when we say there haven't been some imperfections in our history. But one of the great things is that we have created the wealthiest, most successful country of an extraordinary opportunity for all Americans. We have this system of free market, democratic pluralism and openness has created the opportunity to correct ourselves when we have made missteps and when we have had issues that have been unjust or unfair, and ultimately the standard of living and opportunity that has existed in free societies surpasses vastly anything that's been offered. So if you ask me, hey, is free market capitalism a perfect system? My response is no, it's not a perfect system. It's one of the reasons that we were forced into creating some form of safety net and welfare system for the American people, which we need to defend. It's important. Like, no one on our side should be saying that there's not a room for these programs. Maybe you'd structure them differently. Maybe they should be state-run, not federally run. There's probably a lot of things you can do differently and more successfully, and there's way too many people trapped within them that we need to be addressing. But it's important to note that all of the safety net that exists in this country exists because of capitalism, because of the free market system. These safety nets do not exist in most of the world. And in these socialist countries that ran on promises of offering empowerment to the unempowered and impoverished, the poor have gotten poorer, and there's been no net to save them, because ultimately, if the safety net doesn't come from the productivity of a country and its creation of wealth, where would it come from? So even if your issue and your concern is we need to do more to help the poor, we need to do more to help the struggling, all of which I embrace and support, your best system to do that is one that's creating wealth, creating jobs, creating productivity, and that is free market capitalism.
Completely agreed. One of the bones that I would pick, and I agree with you, Thumper Rose, is that, you know, free markets don't necessarily police themselves. Greed can rule, as it has all around the world, no matter what type of economic system you have. Really, it's more about the greed than it is about the type of economic system that is used in that country. But the United States has utterly failed in regulating monopolistic style approaches of companies, the Googles, the Amazons, you can go into healthcare and pharmaceuticals, schools, colleges, all levels of society almost have a top-down monopolistic approach to it. What can we do to further that discussion so that we get through to the people that understand that greed is an issue, but it's not an issue necessarily with free market capitalism. It's how you address the issue that is monopolies.
Yeah, and I don't even think the issue is greed as much as it is the centralization of power that closes out competitors. So if you look at what's going on in Silicon Valley right now, I agree completely with you. I think it's immensely concerning. There's a very compelling case to be made for breaking up these companies, and we do have antitrust statutes on the books federally that the Department of Justice could be exploring and pursuing as it relates to this. This is an elaborate area of American law. It's a complicated area of American law, but ultimately it's designed to prevent collusion, price collusion, and the closing out of competition, because ultimately free market capitalism is about creating a culture, an environment that allows individual entrepreneurship to emerge and to arise and to meet demands of people's needs for products and for services. You can't do that if you've got monopolization of or even oligopolies that are precluding this entrepreneurship from taking place. So we got real issues. I agree with you on particularly in Silicon Valley companies, and this administration has so far expressed verbally some concern about it. Probably the logical next step is to start saying, you got to do something about it. And that relates to censorship too, because one of the big concerns of conservatism, of conservatives, has been the reckless abuse of conservative voices in these new mediums, and how they've been precluded from speaking out, and the double standards that have existed, where it's not, where things on the left are not at all addressed, and conservative voices are shut down. There are private platforms; they probably have technically the legal right to do that. But one of the reasons it's become so damaging is because they're so big.
Yeah.
So I look at a few, some of these conservative organizations. Basically a lot of their communicative abilities come from their ability to navigate these platforms and have to be present on them. And I was encouraged when the Trump administration said they were going to start keeping track of some of these worst cases, and we're going to hold them accountable. And the House, when it was under control of Republicans, said the same thing. That was the good news. The bad news is I have not seen, and maybe I'm missing something, I haven't seen any consequences whatsoever for these companies who continue, as far as I can tell, to shut down conservative voices without any restraint whatsoever.
Not yet, but there is some movement on that. When I do my news blitz at the end of the show today, of the day, I check in at justice.gov, and there has been several discussions and deep discussions about antitrust and things happening behind the scenes on that front, as well as the work that Devin Nunes and others are doing with regards to Twitter. That there's going to be more to come on that front. I want to change the topic quickly.
But my view, not to be too cynical about it, but any day now. I mean, I don't know what.
I know, right?
I don't know what we're waiting. Every day, I got somebody, DMing me, and my account was just blatantly shut down. Not even any real reason. Nobody offers any explanation. Nobody offers any, policy violation. There's no appeal process that's really successful. Nobody's ever accessible to these companies by phone or other means to talk about anything.
Yeah.
And it just so happens it's always some outspoken conservative who's victimized by it. I will see no cases on the left.
Well, as you know,
the Ayatollah have a voice on Twitter.
I know, right? As you know, they can't win in a debate of ideas. When you challenge them in a debate of ideas and solutions, they lose. The only way they can win is basically by rigging the system, changing, silencing voices that are influential, and they know that, and that's why they continue to try to do it before the 2020 election. We'll see what happens on that front. I want to shift gears a little bit to school choice versus public schools. I watched as I was in Illinois as the public school system became a disaster, an absolute, utter, disgusting disaster in Illinois. There are some districts that do well, that have control over their districts, but for the most part, it is a disaster what's happened in Illinois. I watched as Governor Walker and Governor Pence put in policies that were effective at fighting the public sector unions. That is the right to work style policies that enabled teachers to bring ideas forward and to limit the influence of public sector unions in the public school system. When you talk about the differences between school choice and public sector unions, the discussion inevitably goes to, you just wanted to destroy the public school system. Can you talk about why that is a false narrative and why it is important to have school choice in America?
It is false, and we want to see public schools defended and strengthened. We want to see them performing better. The foundation of school choice, and the reason I am a unabashed proponent of it and have been my entire life, is again this idea of competition. Is that if you have a bad, dysfunctional school where every day parents are forced to send their kids to this school, they've long discarded the idea of them coming home any smarter. They just hope they come home alive, and they can't remove those kids from that school, and they have no alternative available to them for the education of their children. It's only strengthens the dysfunction of the system. Competition within education is absolutely crucial. It's crucial also to realize from an educational standards perspective that not every child learns the same way. We force everyone in public schools into this certain box. Some kids do really well in it. Some kids do okay, but could do better. And some kids completely fail out of it. And the system is not designed to be responsive to these, or sufficiently responsive to these individual needs. So the emergence of charter schools and the emergence of religious schools and private schools has offered a great alternative to parents and to kids that need different approaches in education or need a different environment for their education. The issue then becomes, well, how do you pay for it? So if you're already paying taxes into a public system, predominantly on property valuations, which is a somewhat unusual methodology for funding education to begin with, in my judgment. It's certainly created a lot of disparities and challenges within the system, but that's a complicated question. But why should these parents be required basically to pay twice? Why should they have to pay these taxes into a public school system that's failing their kids, not functioning for their kids, and then have to go and pay on top of all of that this individual the private tuition associated with a charter school or a religious school or a private school? So the idea behind school choice has always been one essentially of vouchers, that education should, that the government should fund primary education. Not disputing that, not challenging that thesis, but the idea should be parents, in consultation with children and with these institutions, should have an opportunity to find the educational program that is best suited for them. And if your only choice is one public school and nothing else available, or there are things available but you can't afford them, you don't have that choice.
It's an interesting discussion that we could probably do a whole show on, Michael, and that is the school funding formula and like you said, the disparities that it causes, and not to mention how different jurisdictions use the school funding formula to enrich the administrators while it doesn't trickle down to the people that need it the most. I think there's definitely a discussion that can be had there nationwide with regards to that. One of the things that's happening in Florida is the courts have gone after the equality in school funding between private schools, magnet schools, and public schools. And they have successfully, up until now, there's a Supreme Court ruling that is probably going to change that here in the near future. But I think equality in school funding, regardless of the school, should be a mandate across from the federal government. That's good government control over school systems, not necessarily controlling curriculum and books and the rest.
But we make a big mistake if we conclude or put forward this notion that the problem in education is exclusively one of underfunding. There's abundant examples of schools that are hugely well funded and are abysmal failures, and schools that have been substantially less funded and have been immensely successful. And when we have, I mean, I remember this 40% of fourth graders not being able to read. I'm not sure that's a somewhat dated statistic. Perhaps it's better than that or worse than that now. I'm not sure, but I do recall that statistic from a decade or two or so ago. That's an outrageous number. I mean, does anyone with a straight face believe that 40% of fourth graders cannot read because we're not putting enough money into education? No, it's a problem that's much more systemic and much more related to the way we approach education and the way children interact in those systems, and the support they're receiving at home, and all kinds of complicated questions that go way, way, way beyond funding. Some of these schools, you could triple, quadruple, quintuple the funding, and the challenges would still be as severe. Nonetheless, I do acknowledge there are funding issues.
No, I completely agree. You nailed it, because the left continues to want to throw money at problems, and the majority of school districts in America are spend over, I think it's $15,000, $12,000 to $15,000 per student per year, which is a massive amount of money when you think about it. The funding isn't the problem. I completely agree with you. It's more about lack of competition, lack of holding bad teachers accountable, and not having a curriculum that is beneficial to the student.
Maybe there's other funding sources. I played football in high school, and anybody who's active in a sport like that, you continue to kind of follow what's going on with the team and stuff. They just had their last season on a regular grass surface. They're putting in artificial turf, which is the trend in all of these high schools. The basic budget of it is like $1.6 million, okay, to put this thing in. Now you say, well, gee, that's an extraordinary burden on a school district that's struggling with paying for basic educational needs. But they went out and got sponsorship from the local hospital system for about $1.2 million worth of that. This is just something I'm thinking about because I just happened to read about it, but I'm thinking recently, so it's on my mind. But I'm thinking, if you can get $1.2 million to put in an artificial turf field for one sport that probably represents less than 100 kids on the entire school, and has, 12 games in the season, 6 of which are away, so it's 6 games. Why can you not go out and get that sort of corporate support and funding for more core academic needs? I don't think we do nearly enough in that area. It doesn't even seem like it's an issue of consideration by many of these school boards, or by state legislatures that could put policies in place that would actually encourage and facilitate it, and particularly as it relates to maybe tax deductions or other incentives that could be offered the private sector world to be more philanthropic in educational giving.
Well, of course, you realize that an educated electorate and educated children who go to college and become highly educated are a problem to the left's idea of needing people dependent on government policies.
It depends what type of education you're talking about, because most of the people I'm debating on the left lately have no shortage of resume in the academic area. The problem is those institutions are communicating the wrong, bad ideas. I think ultimately, look, this is a personal view. I think, and it's something that I look when I think of my own educational experiences, the most important skill set you can teach any kid is critical thinking. Is how to assess different ideas, and to not be put into a box, and to realize that to think creatively about problems. And on top of that, I would say this secondary to that is both English communications, the English language and communications, writing and speaking, and an understanding of global and US history, which is just astonishingly bad in this country. It's amazing to me how little it is. And in fact, it's bad on a postgraduate level too. I mean, I've been talking to some attorney friends of mine who said, I graduated from law school. I was never even required to take a class on the Constitution. That's because it's all now precedent. Yep. That's an astonishing reality to think that.
Yeah. That and civics, I mean, there's that you have lawyers that have gone all the way through the bar exam and haven't had any constitutional courses and basic civics courses. It's a disaster of our world right now.
Have you talked to any attorneys? I mean, I talk to these attorneys. I talk to all kinds of attorneys, and corporate issues, and all kinds of different matters, and I'm astonished just how little they really know about the Constitution. Now, obviously there's huge experts out there. I don't mean to say universally that that's true, but I would say your typical town attorney probably, is pretty unschooled on the Constitution.
It's a disaster. It's and it's a big problem
particularly on the Bill of Rights. Particularly on the
Bill of Rights, and it shows itself with these lawfare meatheads running their mouths out there. One last topic I want to get to before I let you go today. I want to take up too much of Mo's time, who's up next, but I wanted to touch on this topic: interventionism versus protectionism. Though you and I are probably, I don't know this, but are probably agreed that interventionism in wars around the world is horrible for America. However, the counter to that is protectionism. That is, we bring all of our troops home and we ignore the world. There is somewhere in the middle. How do we discuss these complex issues of interventionism versus protectionism and not alienate those that are strongly on one side or the other?
Well, we simply have to operate in American interests, and operating in American interests starts with defining what are American interests. So I have long believed that we have an interest around the world. Is there any region in the world where we don't have an interest? Probably not. I would say it's probably every region in the world. We have some definable interest. Now, are those definable interests that you would sacrifice blood or treasure for? In many cases, in most cases, the answer is no. Isolationism is not, in my judgment, a practical reality in the 21st century. I don't think it was a practical reality in the 20th century. And I hasten to even think what kind of world we would live in today had we embraced the isolationist sentiments that were pervasive during the emergence of Nazi Germany, during the emergence of the Soviet Union. This would be a very different world, and we might be in a very different country even. So we have definable interests. I believe peace comes through strength, as Reagan said, so we need to be strong militarily. But between reckless engagement in every country in the world, and particularly in occupations and in nation building, which I think has largely been unsuccessful and counterproductive, and doing nothing, there is this happy medium. And that happy medium is one of defining what are U.S. interests and what are the policies designed to protect and defend those interests when and if they're threatened. And a lot of that has to do with military preparedness and making sure that we are ahead of the curve, and that we should be the strongest military force in the world, capable, in my judgment, of winning 2 or more wars at once, if necessary, in a worst case scenario. And that requires a lot of investment in our military infrastructure. It does not require, as has been the case, say, in Afghanistan, of being engaged in 19-year long military conflicts.
One of the recent things that Mike Lee has made a stance on was the way that the War Powers Act is used. I think we could have a long discussion on that, and I do believe that defining how the military is used via Congress, that's an interesting discussion to have too, because every time politicians get involved with wars, disaster ends up happening. I think when we talk about this, to finish up this discussion here quickly, how we can better use diplomacy and statecraft, the State Department around the world without getting involved militarily is something that this country used to be probably one of the best in the world at doing, and has gotten away from in previous administrations.
Well, I think both China and Russia have become increasingly engaged in diplomatic end global information warfare. There is a battle underway throughout the world, particularly in the developing world of South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, for the hearts and minds of the people of these regions. And the United States, in my judgment, needs to be investing in making our arguments and appealing to good relationships with the not just the governments of these countries, but predominantly with the people. So like some of the things that you've talked about, like the Voice of America, or say Radio Marti, which broadcast into Cuba, or Radio Free Europe, which did so into occupied Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, cannot be underestimated. And if you asked Lech Walesa, the head of Solidarity in Poland, what was the most distinguishable part of being able to liberate ultimately the Warsaw Pact, he would say and offer a bunch of things, but one thing he would undeniably put a lot of emphasis on was that the United States made a commitment to communicating with the people of Poland in Polish when there was no other source of information available under that communist regime. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. It seems to me that there's a lot for us to do, and we should never back away from those challenges or cede those territories to countries that are, I don't want to just say they're universally enemies of the United States, but they're clearly looking to supplant U.S. interests and U.S. ideas and U.S. ideology or freedom in these regions around the world.
It was a pleasure having you here today. I don't want to take up too much of Mo times. We're already a little bit over. Can we do this again sometime? I would love to have you back.
Absolutely. I appreciate all you're doing. Appreciate the work that you've done in the Tea Party movement. Most importantly, that is so you got to everybody who's been a part of this to date is a position in the history of this country, in my view, with the work that we've done. It cannot be underestimated, and part of that is communicating these ideas to people who are predisposed to understanding and acting on them. So thanks so much for what you're doing.
Likewise, I think that's very kind of you, but we know that people like you who have stood up and said enough is enough are what has changed policy for the better in the world. And it always is like that. My father once told me, you can't change the world. I beg to differ, Michael.
You can change the world. There's no doubt about it. We need to operate on the premise that we can change the world. And one of the keys to doing that is that people committed to constructive change and to the defense of our values need to work together. We need to maintain unity. We're each other's brother and sister in this whole thing. We've got to work together.
Amen to that. God bless you, Michael. And we will see you back here sometime in the near future. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, sir.
Michael Johns, everyone. I dropped his information for YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. You can catch him on those platforms. Interact with Michael. Let him know your ideas and how more you can get involved with the Tea Party movement and spreading the word that is, free market conservatism and what it really means. I don't think it's been defined correctly. And those of us who really, truly understand it need to do a better job of getting that out there. So with that, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, Mo. Thank you, Mo, for letting me go over a little bit. I really appreciate that. What do you have planned for us today, Mo?
A little bit of everything, as always. You know me.
Looking forward to it.
Okay.
Looking forward to it. Let me go ahead and get out of your way. Thank you so much, Mo, for giving me that extra few minutes. I really do appreciate it. And to all of you out there who have spent time with us here on the 5x5 Network today, we really do appreciate it. You'll see me back here tomorrow at the same time, as always, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m., sharing what I can find out there that you guys will find interesting for your news day. God bless you all. Have a great afternoon. Coming up next, The Mo Abbey Show with Mo and On.